It was supposed to be a routine day at the research facility, but Eli Turner, NASA's most average astronaut, was feeling anything but routine. His colleagues, an elite group of space engineers, were going over their notes about the Mars mission, a mission that was supposed to secure humanity's future in the stars. Meanwhile, Eli? He was struggling to open a bag of pretzels. The bag had that annoying crinkle that always made him feel like a giant when he tried to open it silently. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Eli knew, deep down, that his own life was as predictable as the failure of that bag. He had been training for nearly 20 years, bouncing from one experiment to the next, always a step behind the real heroes. He was the guy who didn't get the cool assignments, didn't get the glamorous press conferences. His only claim to fame was his ability to blend into the background. Eli Turner, the astronaut who wasn't even sure he was cut out for space. But hey, he was good at one thing, playing it safe. That's exactly why he was here today, in the freezing cold research facility at the edge of Alaska, handling a gravity simulation experiment that was supposed to be a minor task for the real astronauts. But, as usual, Eli wasn't the one chosen for the exciting missions. Oh no, he was the one tasked with the dreary job of testing gravity manipulation equipment for future Mars missions. He clumsily pressed a few buttons on the experimental console in front of him. The room hummed as the artificial gravity began to shift. The other scientists were busy discussing propulsion systems, oblivious to Eli's awkward, huffing attempts to keep his dignity intact. It wasn't the first time he'd been on a mission where he was made to feel like a third wheel, but the difference today was that something small but significant, was about to change. Hey Eli, someone called from the back of the room. Eli turned around, squinting in the harsh overhead lights. It was Karen, one of the lead engineers, who was giving him that look, the kind that said, "I know you're going to screw this up, but I'll be polite about it." "What's up?" Eli asked, trying to sound confident but knowing it wasn't working. "Can you do me a favor and check the gravity field readings for the simulation? I think there's an anomaly." "Anomaly?" Eli repeated, suddenly interested. Karen shot him a glance that conveyed a mix of annoyance and mild amusement. "Just check the numbers. Make sure everything's running as it should." Eli nodded, but as he shuffled over to the console, he could feel the weight of the moment, a sensation that had been growing over the past few months, as though the universe was pressing down on him. He leaned over the control panel, fingers hesitating over the switches. He didn't understand why they were trusting him with this equipment, but there was no turning back now. Without thinking, he pressed a sequence of buttons, a set of controls meant to simulate the shifting of gravitational force for the upcoming Mars landing experiment. But instead of a subtle adjustment, a surge of energy rippled through the room. Eli's heart skipped a beat. The room's gravity began to flicker, growing erratically. "Oh no," Eli muttered to himself. The anomaly wasn't subtle, it wasn't just an error on a readout. The entire room began to feel wrong. Eli's feet lifted off the ground. It wasn't a smooth transition into zero gravity, it was more like a glitch in the system. One moment he was standing, and the next, he was floating several feet above the floor, his body tumbling slightly as the sensation of weightlessness took over. His arms flailed, desperately reaching for something to stabilize himself, but there was nothing. In an instant, the console sparked with electrical energy, and Eli's world tilted on its axis. He wasn't just floating. He was controlling it. He could feel it. This wasn't some malfunction anymore. He was somehow bending the very force that kept him grounded. The sensation of gravity itself was bending to his will. Panicked, Eli reached out, thinking the gravity simulation was just malfunctioning, and he was caught in some bizarre feedback loop. He slammed his hands down on the console to stabilize himself, but instead, the entire room shifted. Eli was yanked sideways, flying toward a wall with the force of a rocket launch, only to be thrust backward the next second, bouncing off another surface like a pinball. The whole scene unfolded like a slapstick comedy, but with Eli as the punchline. He hit a table, knocked over a stack of papers, and finally slammed down onto the ground. For a moment, he lay there, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was certain: he had just broken the laws of physics. Did anyone else feel that? Eli asked, his voice a little shaky, as he looked up. Karen, who had been watching the entire time, stepped forward, eyes wide. Eli, what the hell was that? I don't know. It was like I was controlling the gravity or something. Controlling gravity? She asked incredulously, looking him over. Are you sure you didn't hit your head or something? Eli felt his pulse quicken. Could this be real? Had he actually just manipulated gravity? It felt like it. Everything in the room had shifted according to his subconscious commands. He looked at his hands. There was no way. But there was also no denying what had just happened. The room buzzed with energy as other scientists filed into the room. They were as confused and shocked as Karen. Eli couldn't keep his hands from shaking as they all began to bombard him with questions. Are you sure it was you? One of them asked, voice tinged with disbelief. Eli opened his mouth, but nothing came out. There were too many questions and no answers. This was supposed to be just another day, routine, mundane, but now Eli Turner was a man who had somehow altered the very force that governed everything in the universe. And he didn't know how. Before Eli could say anything, the door to the lab burst open. Standing in the doorway was a man in a sharp, black suit. Eli didn't recognize him at first, but his cold, calculating expression immediately signaled that this wasn't someone from the research team. Mr. Turner, the man said, stepping forward. His voice was clipped, precise. We need you to come with us. Eli blinked, still stunned, his thoughts racing. Who are you? The man didn't answer directly. It's a matter of national security, Mr. Turner. I'm afraid you've just become part of a much larger problem. Eli stood frozen as the man in the black suit moved closer, his presence cutting through the confusion in the room like a blade. There was something cold and deliberate in the way the man held himself, as though he was used to commanding attention. The others in the room instinctively fell silent, sensing the sudden shift in the air. Eli's heart raced, but his mind was still reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I don't understand, Eli stammered. Who are you? What do you want from me? The man ignored his questions, his eyes narrowing as he glanced around the lab, taking in the chaos. You've just demonstrated an ability that no one should have access to. It's far beyond any kind of approved test, the man said, his tone stern. And now, we have to ensure that it doesn't get out of hand. Get out of hand? Eli echoed, his voice cracking. What the hell are you talking about? I didn't mean to. Of course you didn't, the man interrupted smoothly. That's not the point. The point is that you've just stumbled upon something much bigger than you. And now you're a liability. Eli's mind was racing. His body still felt unsteady, as if gravity itself was somehow playing tricks on him. But he couldn't let that distraction take over. He had to figure out what this man was talking about. What do you mean, liability? I don't even understand what happened in there, Eli said, his voice gaining some strength. The man stepped forward, his eyes fixed firmly on Eli, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Let me be clear, he said, lowering his voice, what you have just done is beyond the realm of understanding. You've tapped into a power that could reshape the balance of the world, and I'm afraid we can't afford for that to happen. Not on its own. Eli didn't know whether to feel terrified or outraged. The weight of the man's words felt suffocating. You can't just take me, Eli said, the first flicker of defiance rising in him. You don't even know what's going on. I didn't ask for this. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed by the protest. No one asks for power like this. But you have it. And we're not letting it slip through our fingers. Before Eli could respond, the man motioned toward the door, and two others in similar black suits stepped in. They were silent but imposing. Eli glanced around the room, his eyes darting from one person to another. Karen looked at him with a mix of fear and confusion, but she didn't seem to know what to say. No one seemed to know anything. "Mr. Turner," the man in the suit said, his voice taking on an edge, "it's time to come with us." A cold shiver ran down Eli's spine. Something inside him snapped. The last thing he wanted was to be taken by these strangers, especially when he had no idea what they were planning. The idea of being locked away, of being used like a tool, was too much. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized there was no way he was going to let this happen. The moment stretched out, like a rubber band ready to snap, and Eli made his decision. Without thinking, he pushed himself off the ground, the muscles in his legs straining, and in a desperate act of instinct, he shifted the gravity around him. The air around him seemed to bend, the pressure fluctuating, and he shot upward like a rocket, his body propelled by his own will. He shot straight toward the ceiling, his head grazing the overhead lights as he sped upward. The agents in the black suits reacted too slowly, and Eli found himself suspended in mid-air, hovering just out of their reach. He grinned, adrenaline pumping through his veins, but the sense of triumph was short-lived. He realized just how unprepared he was for this newfound power. His body felt weightless, disoriented. He wasn't controlling it with any precision, he was just floating, helpless to guide himself. "Get down here now," the man in the suit shouted, his voice cutting through the air. Eli's heart was pounding. He wasn't sure how to respond, or how to even land safely. His mind raced, trying to find a way to regain control. He could feel the pull of gravity shifting in unpredictable ways, his body twisting, hovering, drifting like an out-of-control satellite. Panic began to seep in. "Help him, damn it," the man barked at the two agents who had just entered. But they hesitated, unsure how to deal with the situation. Eli took a deep breath, trying to center himself. If he had to get down, he needed to do it in control, not flailing helplessly. Slowly, he focused his mind, calling on the same force that had sent him soaring. This time, he gently pulled at the gravity field beneath him, reversing the pull to ease himself toward the floor. It worked. He began to descend, but not gracefully. He crashed onto the ground with a loud thud, rolling as he hit the floor, pain shooting through his shoulder. Groaning, he pushed himself up, but the pain was a sharp reminder of how dangerous his new abilities could be. The agents moved toward him, but before they could reach him, Eli pushed himself backward, using his powers to create a burst of anti-gravity beneath his feet. He shot backward, the agents narrowly missing him, and collided with a nearby table, sending it skidding across the floor. Eli had no plan, he was acting on pure instinct, doing whatever it took to get away. His heart pounded in his chest. The man in the suit was shouting orders, but Eli wasn't listening anymore. He couldn't afford to. He dashed for the door, his legs pumping, and with one final burst of force, he sent himself flying out of the room, crashing through the hallway. His body felt like it was made of pure energy, weightless and unstoppable, but the world around him seemed to collapse into chaos. The sound of footsteps behind him grew louder. They were chasing him. They wouldn't let him go that easily. Eli burst out into the open air, blinking against the bright sunlight that hit his eyes. He barely registered his surroundings as his body continued to move, guided by panic and desperation. He could hear the commotion behind him, but he didn't dare look back. His mind raced. He couldn't go back to the facility. He couldn't let them take him. The only option was to run, to escape, to somehow figure out what the hell was happening to him. But even as he made his way through the compound, his body beginning to slow, something was nagging at him. The weight of his transformation was already beginning to sink in. Every use of his newfound power was taking its toll on him. His body felt strange, light, but not in a good way. It felt as though something was pulling at him from the inside, his bones and organs twisting under the weight of the force he'd unlocked. Eli didn't know what this power was, how it worked, or why it had chosen him. He had no answers. But he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't let them use him. He couldn't let them turn him into a weapon. He ran harder, deeper into the wilderness surrounding the facility, knowing that time was running out. He could already hear the whir of helicopters above, the unmistakable sound of pursuit. Eli had just become more than human. And for the first time in his life, he was truly afraid of what that meant. Eli's breath was ragged as his legs carried him further into the dense forest that surrounded the facility. His thoughts were a blur, panic and adrenaline coursing through his veins, but beneath it all, the weight of the situation was beginning to settle in. He was running from something far bigger than he could comprehend, and the fear that had gripped him earlier was now starting to feel like a gnawing pit in his stomach. His body felt light, but in a way that was alien, as if gravity itself had become his only companion, and yet, a companion that could betray him at any moment. He pushed himself harder, his feet skimming over the uneven terrain, heart pounding as the whir of helicopters grew louder above. His mind flicked back to the moment he had first realized what had happened, the way he had lifted off the floor without meaning to, the way the room had bent to his will. Control gravity. It sounded absurd. Me? Just a man who'd always been too afraid to step out of the shadows of the real astronauts, but now, everything had changed. He wasn't just a man. He wasn't even sure if he was still human. Whatever had happened to him, whatever this strange, new force was, it had taken hold of him. And it was only a matter of time before it consumed him completely. The trees around him blurred as he ran, his surroundings now indistinct. The helicopters were still above, tracking him, but they weren't as important to Eli as the growing feeling of something shifting inside him. The more he used his power, the more it was changing him. It wasn't just his muscles or his physical state, it was something deeper. The longer he pushed the limits of gravity, the further it twisted his body and mind. He felt like a ghost, disconnected from the world, tethered only by the force that could pull him in any direction at any moment. His chest tightened. Sweat dripped down his face, and his limbs began to ache from the exertion. Despite everything, there was something exhilarating about it. He had been at the bottom of the astronaut food chain for years, just a man who followed orders, never given the chance to prove anything. But now? Now, he had power, real, unexplainable power, and it was both terrifying and intoxicating. The helicopters above were closing in. They weren't going to let him get away. Eli knew that. But something else inside him flickered, a spark of resistance, a need to keep running. He wasn't sure how long he could keep this up. The constant use of his abilities was starting to take a toll on him. His muscles felt weak, his bones aching as if gravity was already beginning to break him down. The momentary relief of floating or shooting forward with bursts of anti-gravity was starting to fade, replaced with an overwhelming feeling of fragility. Like he was a balloon on the verge of popping. With a final burst of will, Eli reached down deep within himself, pushing himself to the next level. The gravity around him shifted again. This time, he didn't just leap forward, he soared. The trees around him stretched below, and the world seemed to bend at the edges of his vision as he shot upward, faster than he'd ever moved before. But in the midst of his flight, his body betrayed him. The pull of the gravitational force was too much, too unpredictable, and Eli felt his control slipping. The world around him spun. His vision blurred as he started to drift too far, his body unable to stabilize. He was falling, no, plummeting. His descent was chaotic, out of his control, and in a matter of seconds, he crashed into the ground with a violent jolt. Pain erupted across his body, and for a moment, everything went dark. When Eli opened his eyes again, the world around him was silent, the sound of the helicopters faded into the distance. He had no idea how long he had been unconscious, but the ache in his body was undeniable. He groaned, pushing himself up on his elbows, disoriented and dizzy. His head spun with a strange lightness. As he stood, the gravity felt off again, pulling at him in strange ways. What was happening to him? He couldn't stay still. Not now. Eli shook his head, forcing his legs to move, to put distance between him and whoever had been chasing him. He had no idea what was happening or why he was being hunted, but he knew he couldn't let them catch him. Not after what he had just realized. This wasn't just an experiment anymore. He wasn't some research project or a test subject. He was something else. He was beyond human, and the more he used his power, the more it consumed him. Every time he reached for it, a little piece of him slipped away. His humanity was fading, replaced by a force he could neither control nor understand. But as he staggered forward, pushing through the underbrush, Eli felt something else, something new and dangerous stirring inside him, a sense of purpose. This power, whatever it was his. He had unlocked something that was meant to be hidden. And if the government wanted him as their tool, as a weapon, they were going to have to kill him first. The idea felt strangely empowering, but it also frightened him. He had no plan, no direction, just the impulse to keep moving, to keep running. The rustling of the trees broke his thoughts, and he instinctively dropped low, moving cautiously. His heart skipped a beat. Someone was close. He could hear the sound of boots crunching through the forest floor, the unmistakable steps of the agents still pursuing him. Eli pressed his back against a tree, trying to steady his breath. He was still disoriented, his limbs unsteady. He couldn't let them see him. He needed to get out of here, get out, he thought, pushing the gravity around him again, but this time he focused, trying to rein in his control. The pressure on the ground shifted, and slowly, very slowly, Eli began to lift off the ground. His body felt like it was floating, but it was different this time. More controlled. More deliberate. He moved through the air, silently, his feet barely touching the ground as he ascended higher, seeking cover in the trees above. He wasn't sure where he was going. He didn't know what he was doing. But it didn't matter. He had to survive. And right now, surviving meant escaping. He hovered higher, threading his way between the branches. The world below seemed smaller, quieter from this new vantage point. He could hear the agents shouting, but they couldn't see him. He was invisible, a ghost in the trees. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eli allowed himself a breath, a small moment of victory. But that victory was short-lived. A sharp crack echoed through the trees, and Eli's body was pulled down with a violent force. He wasn't sure what had happened. The pressure around him increased. No, it wasn't his power. Someone had done something to him. His mind raced, trying to understand, but before he could react, the world tilted, and everything went dark again. When he came to, the world was upside down. Eli's hands were bound, his body pressed against the cold, rough ground. His vision cleared, and he realized with a sickening feeling that he had been captured. The agents had gotten him. They were smarter than he thought, and they weren't about to let him escape again. The man in the black suit was standing above him, watching. His expression was cold, calculating. "You're not in control anymore, Mr. Turner," the man said. "And now, we're going to find out just how much of you is left." Eli tried to move, but the ropes around his wrists were tight. His legs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if gravity was working against him. His mind buzzed with panic, but he couldn't escape. "Not now. You'll never understand what you've become," the man continued. "But we will. And we will use it. For the good of humanity." For the first time, Eli realized just how far this had gone. He wasn't just a man caught in a strange experiment. He was something more, something dangerous, and the people chasing him knew it. He wasn't just running from them, he was running from himself. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if he wanted to be found.